He said, "Stay with garbage. That's where you belong." Then he shoved me. It wasn't even a hard shove, just one of those careless, confident movements that says you don't matter enough to resist. I lost my balance, the metal edge scraped my shin, and suddenly I was in it. The dumpster behind the storage lot, surrounded by what people throw away when they don't want to remember they ever owned it. The lid slammed shut with a sound that still echoes in my sleep. I lay there for a few seconds, the sour smell of rot pressing into my skin, listening to his footsteps fade. He laughed as he walked off. That was the part that hurt more than the shove. The laughter. It was the sound of a man who believed no one would ever call him to account for what he'd just done. My name is Eleanor Hart. I am 81 years old. I live now in a single room above a church thrift shop in a town that doesn't ask too many questions. There's a narrow bed, a kettle, a window that faces the alley, and a calendar from 2018 that the last tenant left behind. I keep it because all the months are clean and empty, like a new beginning that waited too long. I'm telling this story because silence has never saved me. It only made cruel people more comfortable. I used to think that cruelty came with heat, with shouting, fists, or slammed doors. But the truth is, it's cold. It wears a pleasant smile, holds the door open, and says, "You should rest. You've done enough." My son, Alex, learned that tone from his father. He was never overtly violent. He didn't have to be. He used language the way other men use locks. Every word shut me a little further out of my own life. When he pushed me into that dumpster, it wasn't the first time he'd decided where I belonged. It was just the first time he did it with his hands instead of his voice. I'd come to see him that morning because he'd called the night before, saying he wanted to sort out the storage situation. His tone was unusually soft, almost affectionate, the kind that makes you hope something good is about to happen. He said he was worried about me living alone since the fall, that maybe it was time to downsize, maybe sell the house and move into something easier. He promised he'd take care of everything. "Just sign a few papers, Mom." I told him I'd think about it. He said, "No rush." But I knew that tone too. The kind that means there will be pressure, just not yet. I barely slept. I kept telling myself he meant well. A mother's instinct is the last thing to die, even after dignity. The next morning, he picked me up in his truck. It was cleaner than I remembered, the kind of clean that feels staged. He'd shaved, worn a pressed shirt. I noticed new shoes. The scent of his cologne was sharp and artificial, like citrus trying to cover decay. I brought a small box of his childhood things. Photographs, the clay handprint he made in 3rd grade, a postcard from a fishing trip we took before his father died. I wanted to give them back, to remind him that he came from something warmer than whatever he'd turned into. He didn't look at the box. He just said, "We'll deal with all that later," and turned up the radio. The storage facility sat behind an auto shop on the edge of town, a place where people store what they can't bear to throw away but don't want to see. When we arrived, he asked me to help him sort a few boxes before the sale. His voice was steady, almost bored. We worked for a while in the stale air of the unit, surrounded by half-forgotten furniture and the smell of dust. He found an old tin of coins that had belonged to my husband and slipped it into his jacket pocket without looking at me. I noticed. I said nothing. Years of motherhood had trained me for silence. At some point, he started talking about the house. He said keeping it was sentimental nonsense, that I couldn't manage it, that the neighborhood was going downhill. I told him I liked my garden, the small patch of roses I still tended. He laughed, a short, mean sound. "Mom, you can't even carry the watering can anymore." I felt something close in me then, not anger, just the slow settling of a truth I'd been avoiding. He didn't see me as a person anymore, just an obstacle dressed in frailty. When I said I wasn't ready to sell, he looked at me the way a man looks at a broken lock he's about to replace. We were standing near the dumpster when it happened. He'd been pacing, muttering about paperwork, about how stubborn I was. He said something about power of attorney, about signatures, about how the bank will need proof you're not losing it. I told him calmly that my mind was fine, that he should be careful what he was suggesting. He smiled then, that slow, practiced smile that always came before cruelty. "Oh, Mom," he said softly, "you've been losing it for years." I think he wanted me to slap him. I didn't. I just looked at him, and maybe that look, that quiet refusal, was what made him do it. He stepped forward suddenly, one hand on my shoulder, the other on the edge of the bin. It wasn't premeditated, not exactly, but it wasn't accidental either. My feet slipped on the gravel, and I went in backward. The lid slammed. The air was thick with the smell of spoiled fruit, coffee grounds, and something metallic. I heard his shoes scuff against the pavement, heard his car door open, then the engine start. For a moment I thought he'd come back, but the sound of the car faded, and the only thing left was the faint buzzing of flies. I lay there longer than I should have, trying to decide what hurt more, my back or my pride. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I hoped he hadn't dented the bin. He'd only complain later that I'd cost him money. That was the moment I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Fear requires hope, the hope that the other person might change, might apologize, might still love you. I had none of that left. Only a strange calm, like standing in cold water until you stop feeling the chill. When I finally pushed the lid open, daylight sliced in, a thin, pitiless line. I used it like a rope, pulled myself up, and climbed out, trembling but upright. My knees were bleeding. My palms smelled of decay. I brushed off what I could and started walking. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I wouldn't go home. I didn't have a phone. He'd taken it for safekeeping earlier that morning, said he'd charge it for me. It was a small detail I hadn't questioned, one of those small kindnesses that come wrapped around control. I walked until the sun began to drop. A woman at a gas station asked if I was all right. I told her I was fine. It wasn't true, but it wasn't false either. I was alive, and that was something. I sat behind the station for a while, watching the highway shimmer in the distance, and thought about how easily a life can tilt from ordinary to absurd. One moment you're folding laundry, the next you're crawling out of a dumpster, your son's laughter still echoing somewhere between your ears and your bones. That night, I found shelter in a bus station. The janitor gave me a cup of water and a paper towel for my knees. I didn't tell him what happened. People see an old woman and assume she's fallen. They never guess she's been pushed. I stared at my reflection in the glass door, the dirt on my face, the strand of gray hair stuck to my cheek. And I thought, this is what the end of illusion looks like. So that's where it begins, not in tragedy, but in clarity. The day my son put me with the garbage, I stopped trying to earn a place in his world. He threw me away, but he forgot that the trash gets collected. And sometimes, what you throw out has a way of finding its own purpose once it's back in the light. That night at the bus station, I didn't sleep. The benches were narrow and hard, and every sound, wheels rolling, doors hissing open, announcements for routes I'd never take, kept me alert, hovering somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. I sat upright, hands folded over my knees, and tried to replay the day in slow motion, as if careful study might reveal a reason behind what he'd done. Mothers are trained for excuses. We manufacture them the way the body produces breath. He was under stress, I thought. He didn't mean it. But then I remembered the way his laughter echoed off the concrete, the way he hadn't looked back even once, and the effort of forgiving him felt obscene, like trying to polish a weapon that had just drawn your blood. By morning, I knew I couldn't go home. The keys were gone. The spare hidden under the porch likely moved, and even if I could get in, what would I walk into? He had all the papers, the will, the insurance files, the deeds I had signed with shaking hands years ago when I still believed in family legacy. Alex had always been persuasive, a salesman by nature, charming in the way that emptiness sometimes learns to mimic warmth. The last few months he'd started calling more often, his tone gentle, solicitous. Too gentle. I mistook it for care. Now I realized it had been reconnaissance. He was mapping my vulnerabilities, testing which ones would yield quickest. He'd offered to help manage my accounts after I'd mentioned that the online banking system confused me. I gave him access because that's what trust looks like when you don't want to admit you're afraid of your own child. At the bus station, I asked a security guard for directions to the nearest branch of my bank. He looked at me warily, then softened. "It's 2 blocks down, ma'am, but it doesn't open till 9. I thanked him and sat back down. When the doors finally opened, I walked there slowly, counting every step. Because sometimes the only way to keep standing is to move methodically, as if rhythm alone could keep you from falling apart. The teller, a young woman with pink-rimmed glasses, greeted me with professional brightness that dimmed the moment she looked at my clothes. I could smell the garbage on me still, the faint sour trace that wouldn't wash away until much later. I told her I needed to check my account balance. She asked for my ID. I handed it over and watched her type. Her expression changed, subtle, cautious. "It looks like your son was added as joint holder last month," she said carefully, "and there have been several transfers since then." My stomach turned cold. "Transfers where?" I asked. "To another account under his name. Do you want me to print a statement?" She slid the paper across the counter, and I looked down at the numbers, each one a small betrayal, each deduction a slice of trust. The total left in my account wouldn't cover a week at a motel. I stood there longer than was polite, the edges of the paper trembling in my hands. The teller asked if I wanted to speak to a manager, but I could already hear the futility in her voice. I said no. I thanked her and left. Outside, the sky was too bright, the kind of brittle sunlight that exposes rather than warms. I realized then that the shove into the dumpster wasn't a moment of rage. It was the full stop at the end of a long sentence he'd been writing for years. It was punctuation, not impulse. I went to the police station next. It was only 4 blocks away, a squat brick building that smelled faintly of disinfectant and resignation. The officer at the front desk listened politely as I explained what had happened. He asked if I had witnesses. I said no. He asked if I had visible injuries. I lifted my sleeve to show the bruise blooming on my arm like an ugly flower. He nodded sympathetically, then explained that without witnesses or camera footage, it would be my word against his. When I mentioned the money, he said that since my son was a joint holder, It wasn't technically theft. He gave me a pamphlet about elder resource services and told me to contact Adult Protective Services if I felt unsafe. I folded the pamphlet neatly, thanked him for his time, and walked out. There's a point in every woman's life when she understands the system isn't broken, it's perfectly designed for disbelief. The catalyst wasn't the shove. It wasn't even the stolen money. It was that moment in the police lobby when I realized the only person who was going to believe me was me. That realization doesn't arrive with fireworks. It comes quietly, like the moment you notice you're cold and have been for a long time. I walked until I found a cafe, ordered the cheapest cup of coffee they had, and sat in the corner. My hands shook too much to lift the cup at first. I kept seeing his face, not the boy who used to run down the driveway calling Mama, "Watch me," but the man with the thin smile who'd learned that a mother's love was a currency he could spend endlessly. I tried to summon anger, but all I could feel was exhaustion, the kind that seeps into your bones and rearranges how you breathe. I took the pamphlet out of my purse and read it. It listed numbers for shelters, counseling hotlines, financial recovery programs. The print was small, the paper cheap, but it was something tangible, a map, however flimsy. I called one of the numbers from a payphone outside. A woman answered, calm, warm, practiced. She asked where I was, if I was injured, if I had somewhere safe to stay. I told her about the bus station. She said there was a senior resource center a few miles away and that they could send a volunteer to pick me up. For a moment, I hesitated. Accepting help after a lifetime of giving it feels like crossing a river without knowing if the ice will hold. But then I said yes. A man named Luis arrived 30 minutes later in a van with the logo of the Community Outreach Center. He was middle-aged, kind eyes, soft voice. He didn't ask questions right away, just offered me a bottle of water and a blanket. As we drove, I watched the city blur by. Storefronts, traffic lights, people walking their dogs, all the ordinary life I'd somehow fallen out of. When we arrived, the building looked like any other small-town community center. Fluorescent lights, outdated posters about flu shots, a bulletin board with curling flyers for lost pets. But inside, it was warm. A woman at the desk took my name, offered me tea, and led me to a small room with a couch and a lamp that worked. She told me I could rest there until a caseworker arrived. I don't know how long I sat there before I began to cry. Not the loud, dramatic kind of crying, but the quiet leak that starts in the throat and finds its way down. It wasn't grief for the lost money or even the bruises. It was mourning for the illusion of family. I'd built my whole identity around motherhood, poured decades of energy into a son who saw me as raw material for his convenience. Sitting there, I realized how many small compromises had paved the way for that dumpster. The times I'd said it's fine when it wasn't. The times I'd given him more than he asked for, because love, I thought, should be unconditional. But unconditional is a dangerous word. It's how predators train loyalty in the kind-hearted. When the caseworker came, she introduced herself as Dara. She was young, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that didn't look away. She asked if I wanted to press charges. I said I'd already tried. She nodded like she'd heard that story before. She explained that they could help me file for emergency housing and start a claim for financial abuse. I listened, numb, while she filled out forms. When she asked for my signature, I almost laughed. My hand trembled as I wrote my name. The same signature I'd once given my son on those documents he said were for my benefit. Only this time, it was mine alone. When she left the room, I looked around. The walls were painted a dull beige, the kind meant to soothe, but it did. I wasn't in my house, but I wasn't in the dumpster either. Somewhere between humiliation and safety, there's a strange kind of freedom, a clarity that asks, if everything you've built can be stolen, what will you build now? That question hovered as I lay down on the narrow cot they provided. I thought of my garden, the roses I'd planted the year after my husband died, and how every spring they came back, stubborn and defiant, no matter how harsh the winter. I closed my eyes and decided I'd come back too, though I didn't yet know how or where. By the time morning came again, I'd made one simple decision. I would not disappear. If he wanted to erase me, he would have to do it in public, under light too bright for lies. That decision, small as it was, shifted something fundamental. The world hadn't changed. I still had nothing. No money, no home, no son. But for the first time in years, I also had no illusions. That was the beginning of everything that came after, the slow and deliberate act of rebuilding from the ruins of trust. It started not with forgiveness or rage, but with the simple, dangerous choice to keep existing on my own terms. The days that followed unfolded like slow-moving weather, each one gray, slightly different in tone, but carrying the same heavy air. I stayed at the outreach center for a week, sleeping in a cot beside a window that never opened properly, eating soup that always tasted faintly of metal from the industrial pots. There was a rhythm to the place. Footsteps in the hallway before dawn, the smell of disinfectant. Voices murmuring names that were not real names, but new ones. Martha becoming Mary 2, Helen becoming Room 5. People came and went, mostly women my age, some with bruises, some with nothing visible but the look of someone who has learned how to shrink without moving. I learned quickly that stories here were currency, but also confession. You told them to prove you existed, not to seek sympathy. When someone asked what happened to me, I said, "My son made a mistake." And that was enough. They all knew what that meant. I spent most mornings in the small common room where a television played daytime talk shows on low volume. The hosts smiled too much, their teeth too white, their laughter mechanical. I found comfort in their falseness. It made my own reality feel honest by comparison. One woman, Agnes, sat beside me often. She'd been a nurse once, retired early after her husband's death. Her daughter had taken her savings to invest and then disappeared. She told the story without bitterness, as if reciting weather patterns from another continent. I asked her how she managed not to hate. She said, "Hate needs energy. I spent mine surviving." That line stayed with me, looping quietly whenever I woke at night and felt the ache in my ribs where the edge of the dumpster had caught me. Dara visited every 2 days, carrying folders, asking questions in her calm, precise way. She had a habit of looking directly into my eyes, even when the answers I gave were small or hesitant. She told me she'd contacted the bank, that there were ways to contest the joint account transfers, though it would take time. I asked about my house, and she said that if the title had been altered, we'd need legal proof to reverse it. "Do you have any of the original documents?" she asked. I hesitated. I remembered the copy I had kept in a metal box under the bed, the one I assumed he hadn't found. I told her yes. She said we'd find a way to retrieve it. It was the first time someone had used the word "we" with me in months. On the 7th day, they moved me into a temporary apartment above a thrift store owned by the church. The space was narrow but private. 2 small rooms, and a shared bathroom down the hall. The floor creaked with a sound that reminded me of my old kitchen, the one I used to clean every Sunday before Alex came for dinner. I hung the single dress I owned on the doorknob to keep it from wrinkling and placed my purse beside the bed like a talisman. That night, I boiled water in a dented kettle, poured it over an old tea bag, and drank slowly, savoring the quiet. The steam fogged the window, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel invisible. The following morning, I went downstairs and asked the woman who ran the thrift shop if she needed help. Her name was Joan, short and brisk, with arms like a longshoreman's and a heart that beat louder than her voice. She looked me up and down and said, "You can sort donations. It's boring work, but you'll stay warm." I thanked her. The job paid nothing, but the small allowance the center gave me stretched further when I didn't have to think about heat. I began spending my days there, sorting through other people's cast-offs, clothes that smelled faintly of strangers, chipped mugs, wedding dresses yellowed at the seams. It felt oddly fitting to handle the remnants of other lives while rebuilding my own. Sometimes I'd find a note pinned to a coat, a name written in a shaky hand, and I'd wonder if the person who gave it away knew what it meant to let go. In the evenings, when the store closed, I'd stay behind to sweep. Joan pretended not to notice, but once she left a plate of cookies by the register with a note, "Eat them, or I'll be offended." That small act of kindness nearly undid me. I'd forgotten what it felt like to receive something without conditions. I wrote her a thank you note in pencil because I didn't trust my handwriting to be steady in pen. She never mentioned it, but she started greeting me every morning with, "Good to see you, kid." No one had called me that in 40 years. Still, the fear lingered. Every creak in the hallway made me tense. Every unfamiliar voice outside the door pulled me back to that sound, the lid slamming shut, his laughter. Sometimes, in the half-light before dawn, I'd dream I was still in the dumpster, unable to climb out because the garbage around me kept shifting, burying me slowly. In those dreams, I never screamed. I just waited for something to notice me. When I woke, I'd press my hand against the wall until my heartbeat steadied. I told Dara about the dreams once. She said trauma often loops in silence before it speaks in words. "You're remembering what it felt like to have no witness," she told me. "But you have one now." I didn't know if she meant herself or me, maybe both. A month after the incident, she brought news. They'd traced the transfer trail. Alex had moved my funds through several accounts, some in his business's name, others under shell companies. It would take time to unravel. She asked if I wanted to file a civil claim for elder abuse. I said yes, but only after a pause long enough for her to ask if I was sure. I told her I wasn't doing it for revenge. I wanted a record, something official that said I existed, and what was done to me was real. She nodded, her expression unreadable but kind. She handed me a pen, and I signed. That evening, I walked outside for the first time in weeks. The air was sharp, the sky pale with the last light of winter. Across the street, a man was throwing away boxes into a dumpster, the same metallic sound ringing through the alley. I froze, then forced myself to keep walking. The fear was there, but it was smaller now, containable. I turned the corner and found a small bakery still open. Inside, the warmth was immediate, thick with the smell of yeast and sugar. I bought a single roll with the few dollars I had left and sat by the window, eating it slowly. Each bite tasted like memory, something simple, human, clean. Back in the apartment, I began to write. Not letters to him, those were pointless, but notes to myself. Sentences that began with, "You will" instead of "I should." "You will stand up straight." "You will speak when asked." "You will not apologize for being visible." I filled 3 pages before sleep came. In the morning, I read them aloud. The words sounded strange, but they belonged to me. A few days later, Joan handed me an envelope. "Someone dropped this off," she said. There was no return address, just my name written in neat block letters. Inside was a printed notice from a law firm. Notice of intent to sell property. My property. The house I had lived in for 40 years, the one he said was too much for me. My breath caught. The sale date was set for 2 weeks from now. I showed the paper to Dara. She frowned. "He can't do that legally, not while there's a pending investigation, but it's messy. He's counting on you to be too tired to fight." She looked at me. "Are you?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to hand her the burden, to retreat into the quiet safety of surrender. But then I saw my reflection in the glass door of her office. Tired, thin, but upright. "No," I said. "Not anymore." That night, I went through the donations in the back room and found an old coat, thick wool with a missing button. I patched it with a spare piece of fabric and tried it on. It fit, snug around the shoulders, heavy enough to remind me I was still solid. I packed a small bag, my identification, the copy of the deed I'd saved, and the letter from the law firm. In the morning, I told Dara I wanted to go back, just for a day. She hesitated, then agreed to come with me. The drive to my old neighborhood felt like traveling backward through time. The streets were the same, but smaller. The houses neater. The trees bare. When we turned onto my street, I saw the for sale sign staked into my front lawn, the letters bold and unapologetic. The garden was dead, the roses brittle stalks. Through the window, I could see movement, figures packing boxes. A woman's laughter drifted out. Not Carla's, not a stranger's, but his. Alex's voice, calm and sure, telling someone about downsizing for his mom's safety. My name was being used like a brand, a convenient fiction. Dara put a hand on my arm, but I stepped out of the car before she could stop me. I walked up the path, ignoring the ache in my knees, and knocked on my own door. The man who opened it wore a realtor's badge. His smile faltered when I introduced myself. Behind him, Alex appeared, his face draining of color for just a moment before he regained composure. "Mom," he said, voice smooth, professional. "You shouldn't be here. We're handling it." I looked past him at the boxes labeled estate items. I took out the copy of the deed and placed it on the table near the doorway. "That's mine," I said quietly. "You don't get to erase me from the paperwork or from the world." He started to protest, but Dara stepped forward, handing him a card from the legal aid office. "Any further sale or transfer will be considered fraudulent," she said firmly. He blustered, shouted something about misunderstanding, but I didn't listen. I turned and walked out, down the same steps I'd once swept every morning, and for the first time, I didn't look back. That night, I returned to my small apartment above the thrift store. The floor creaked again, the kettle hissed, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer something pressing down from above. It was something I could hold, examine, even learn from. I wasn't the same woman who'd been shoved into a dumpster and left there. I was someone else now. Someone who could climb out, who could face what had been stolen, who could reclaim, inch by inch, the territory of her own name. The morning after confronting Alex at the house felt strangely quiet, as if the air itself were pausing to see what I would do next. I woke before sunrise. The window cracked just enough to let in the chill of early spring. The kettle on the small stove hissed its familiar tune, and I poured the hot water over the single tea bag I'd been reusing for 3 days. I watched the color bloom slowly in the cup, faint but insistent, the way new strength creeps in after long paralysis. My hands no longer trembled. My back still ached from the long walk up and down the steps of what used to be my home, but the pain had a purpose now. It was the kind of soreness that follows reclamation, not defeat. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman whose life had cracked open, and through the crack, something like light was beginning to leak. That day, Dara came to check on me. She carried 2 cups of real coffee from a cafe nearby, and the smell alone felt like an extravagant gift. We sat by the window of the thrift store's break room, the morning light cutting across her face, making her look older, though maybe it was just the seriousness of what she was about to say. She told me that the case had been officially accepted for review by the district attorney's office. It didn't mean much yet, no promises, no restitution, but it meant someone in a position of authority had decided that my story wasn't just another family dispute. I remember nodding slowly, afraid to feel relief too quickly. I'd spent so long being dismissed that belief itself felt dangerous. She asked me if I'd considered finding permanent housing, maybe even a small job to fill the days. I laughed at first. What kind of job takes an 81-year-old woman who still forgets her passwords and limps when it rains? But she didn't laugh with me. Instead, she said, "The bakery down the street needs someone to prep the early orders. They pay by the hour. It's quiet work. The owner's kind." Her tone was casual, but I could tell she'd already spoken to them. I hesitated, unsure if I could handle standing on my feet for hours. Then I remembered how good it had felt to sweep the thrift store at night, the rhythm of movement, the return of usefulness. I said yes. The first day at the bakery was awkward, like learning to live in a body I'd forgotten how to use. The ovens breathed out steady waves of heat that made my skin feel both alive and fragile. The smell of butter and yeast filled every corner, and for a while I was just part of it, another ingredient in the process. The owner, a small woman named Beatrice, spoke little but smiled often. She showed me how to knead the dough slowly, with patience instead of force. "It listens," she said. "It knows when you're rushing." I found that true about more than dough. Every morning I arrived before dawn, my hands dusted with flour, my mind quiet. For the first time in years, my worth wasn't measured by obedience or sacrifice. It was in the clean weight of the loaves lined in a row, warm and fragrant, proof that I could still make something rise. In the evenings, I began to take walks again. The town wasn't much. 2 main streets, a library, a laundromat, and a park that smelled of damp leaves. But it had corners of stillness where I could think without being interrupted by memory. I would sit on a bench near the duck pond, watching the surface ripple whenever the wind passed. There was a man who came there often too, always carrying a sketchbook. He must have been in his 70s, tall, with a face that seemed carved from kindness and regret. One afternoon, he sat beside me and said, "You have a steady posture. Most people fold into their age, but you don't." I told him I'd had enough folding for a lifetime. His name was Arthur, a retired art teacher who lived 3 streets over. We didn't exchange much at first, just polite greetings, but his presence became a small anchor in the drift of my days. It was around this time that I began to feel something like return. not to the past, but to myself. The world hadn't softened. If anything, it remained indifferent. Yet within that indifference was a freedom I hadn't known before. No one expected anything from me. No one called with demands or apologies. My time was my own, unremarkable and precious. I started to write again, not letters this time, but fragments of thought, small reflections on survival and recognition. "There is no such thing as wasted tenderness," I wrote one evening. "Even if it falls on stone, it leaves a mark." Still, memory is not a thing you can evict. Some nights, the old house would visit me in dreams, each room perfectly intact, waiting. In one dream, I was standing in the kitchen, and the window above the sink was open. I could hear Alex's voice calling from the backyard, but when I looked out, the yard was gone. Only a wide black pit in its place. I would wake, drenched in sweat, the taste of earth still in my mouth. Sometimes I wanted to hate him, to let anger be the heat that kept me moving. But hatred requires the same intimacy as love. It keeps you tied to the person who broke you. I decided to choose distance instead. Dara told me the investigation was progressing. They'd found evidence of forged signatures, suspicious withdrawals, even communications with real estate agents pretending to act on my behalf. "It's serious now," she said. "He might face charges." I nodded, not with satisfaction, but with a dull sort of wonder. The idea of my son behind bars didn't please me, but neither did the idea of him free. What I wanted was not punishment, but correction, a restoration of the record, proof that I had been wronged and yet survived. Justice, I was learning, isn't about balance. It's about visibility. Around this time, I began to see Arthur more often. He would bring me sketches, simple pencil drawings of birds or trees, or sometimes just the outline of a woman sitting by a pond. One day, he handed me a drawing of hands, old and wrinkled, but strong. "Yours," he said, and I was startled by how accurate they were. The veins like rivers, the fingers slightly bent but purposeful. "You draw people the way you see them," I said. "Not the way they are." He smiled. "Is there a difference?" I didn't answer, but later, walking home, I realized there was. The difference was mercy. The bakery became my sanctuary. Beatrice would hum while she worked, little half-songs without melody. She told me she'd lost her husband years ago, but never removed his coffee mug from the shelf. "I keep it there," she said, "because grief behaves better when you feed it small memories." I understood that. Each morning, as I shaped the loaves, I thought of my own small memories. The sound of rain on the roof of my old house, the smell of my husband's aftershave, the way Alex used to fall asleep in the back seat after long drives. I didn't try to erase them anymore. They were part of the landscape of survival. One afternoon, while I was cleaning the counter, Beatrice handed me an envelope. "A young man came in earlier," she said. "Left this for you. Said it was personal." My heart stumbled. For a moment I feared it was Alex trying to reach me through some new manipulation. But when I opened the envelope, the handwriting stopped me. It was careful, slanted slightly to the right. Kieran's, my grandson. I hadn't seen him in years, not since before Alex and I stopped speaking regularly. The note was brief. "Grandma, I heard something happened. Dad won't say much. I'm worried. Please let me know you're okay." At the bottom, a phone number. I read the letter 3 times, the paper softening under my fingers. It felt like a hand reaching across the debris of everything I'd lost. I didn't call immediately. I wasn't ready to let my voice shake in front of anyone connected to Alex. But I folded the note carefully and tucked it into my apron pocket. For the rest of the day, the dough seemed lighter. the oven warmer. The past, I realized, was not one unbroken wall. There were cracks where light could enter, where something decent might still grow. That night, I walked to the pond again. Arthur was there, sketching as usual. I told him about the letter. He nodded slowly, as if the world had just confirmed something he already believed. "You'll call him when you're ready," he said. "Healing has its own clock." I looked at the dark water and said, "Maybe the real healing is realizing I still want to." He didn't answer. He just kept drawing, and the sound of his pencil on paper felt like the quiet approval of the universe. As I walked home under the dim streetlights, I realized something had shifted inside me. The fear that had once dictated my every move was receding, replaced by a steady resolve. I wasn't the woman waiting for rescue anymore. I was the one kneading her own future into shape, letting it rise slowly, stubbornly, under her own warmth. The journey wasn't over, but the direction was clear. I had crossed from being a person discarded to being a person reclaimed. And that, I thought, is what survival truly means. Not just crawling out of the dumpster, but learning to walk away from it without looking back. The week after Kieran's letter arrived, the air in town changed. It wasn't the weather exactly, though spring had begun to warm the mornings, but something subtler, like a shift in pressure before a storm. Every day at the bakery, I found myself glancing toward the window, half expecting someone to appear on the sidewalk, someone from a life I'd left behind. For weeks, I had moved quietly through this new rhythm. Wake before dawn, walk to the bakery, shape loaves, watch the world brighten outside the flour-dusted glass. But now, a small thread of unease began winding through those hours. It was the kind that starts in the gut and climbs upward, patient and deliberate, until even the simplest tasks feel slightly fragile. I told myself it was only imagination, that peace, once learned, does not have to be defended. Still, I started locking the back door twice. I carried Kieran's letter everywhere. The fold was wearing thin at the edges, and once, while I was counting change at the register, Beatrice noticed it peeking out of my apron pocket. "Love note," she teased lightly. I smiled, but didn't answer. I couldn't explain to anyone how something as small as a few written lines could restore an entire lineage inside you. He was the one who used to sit beside me as a child, helping me plant tulip bulbs, asking questions that made the world seem like an open door instead of a locked room. When I read his words, "I'm worried. Please let me know you're okay," I could hear the boy's voice under the man's handwriting, and it made me ache with both gratitude and regret. I still didn't call him. Instead, I memorized the number. I wanted the words to form from strength, not longing, when I finally spoke. Dara stopped by the bakery that Thursday. Her face looked different, less professional, more protective. She waited until the last customer left, then motioned for me to join her at a corner table. "He's been looking for you," she said quietly. "Your son." My body went still. She explained that he had hired a private investigator, claiming I was missing, vulnerable, possibly under the influence of coercion. "He's trying to build a narrative," she continued. "Something to protect himself if the charges go through." I could feel the blood rising in my ears, a dull pulse of disbelief that quickly turned to clarity. "He wants me to look unstable," I said. Dara nodded. "He wants to rewrite the story before it's written officially." I asked her what I should do. She told me to stay where I was, keep records, and avoid confrontation. "Truth takes time to catch up," she said, "but it always does." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the street lamp flicker and thought about how many times he had told me that memory was unreliable, that I misremembered conversations, misread his tone, exaggerated the sharpness in his words. The manipulation had been so slow, so consistent, that even after everything, the shove, the theft, the abandonment, I still had to remind myself that my pain was real. Abusers don't just steal money or homes, they steal definition too. They make you doubt your own chronology until your story starts to feel like a rumor. I promised myself then that I would not let him have the ending. 2 days later, the article appeared. Beatrice found it first. She came in holding the morning paper, her mouth pressed into a thin line. She didn't say anything at first, just laid it gently on the counter, her finger pointing to the headline, "Missing Elderly Woman. Family Seeks Answers." Beneath it was my name, my photograph, an old one, taken at a family barbecue years ago, me smiling with a pie dish in my hands. The article described me as an aging mother believed to be suffering from mental decline, who had vanished under concerning circumstances. There were quotes from Alex and his wife. "We're desperate for her safe return," they said. "We just want her back where she belongs." My stomach turned. Where I belonged. The same phrase he had used that day by the dumpster. I read the article twice, my hands shaking, then folded it neatly and placed it on the counter. "Well," I said finally, "at least they used a flattering picture." Beatrice stared at me, eyes wide. "What are you going to do?" I poured myself a cup of coffee, steadying my hand before answering. "I'm going to live exactly where I am," I said. "That's what I'm going to do." But living quietly became harder after that. People in town began to look at me differently, curiosity mixed with pity. I could feel their eyes linger when I walked home from work. One afternoon, a woman I barely knew stopped me outside the grocery store and asked if I was that lady from the news. I told her I wasn't. She didn't believe me. Gossip has a way of settling on truth like dust, dulling it until you can't tell the difference between what's clean and what's contaminated. I began taking the side streets, wearing a hat low over my face, though part of me was almost amused by the absurdity of it all. An old woman mistaken for her own ghost. The article was followed by a letter from a law firm representing my son. It arrived at the bakery, addressed in neat professional script. The letter was a performance of concern. "We are deeply worried about your well-being. We ask that you contact us immediately to confirm your safety and discuss potential arrangements regarding your estate." Beneath the politeness, I could hear the metallic click of control tightening. I handed the letter to Dara, who sighed and began drafting a formal response on my behalf, stating that I was of sound mind and residing safely by choice. But the encounter left a residue of unease. Control, once lost, rarely dies quietly. It claws at the edges of your new life, trying to reassert itself under the guise of love. Around that same time, Arthur stopped by the bakery more often. He never mentioned the article, though I knew he'd seen it. Instead, he began bringing small gifts: a jar of homemade jam, a packet of birdseed, a hand-drawn card of 2 sparrows perched on a fence. "They look like they trust each other," I said once. He smiled. "They look like they've survived a winter." His company steadied me in ways I didn't expect. We would sit in the park on my days off, talking about ordinary things: the stubbornness of weeds, the quiet politics of neighbors, the texture of silence after a long storm. I told him bits of my story. Not everything. just enough for him to understand why I sometimes flinched at sudden noises. He never asked for more. It was a relief to be known in fragments rather than as a tragedy. Then came the afternoon when Beatrice walked in, eyes anxious. "There's someone asking about you," she whispered. "A woman. Says she's family." My body froze. Through the front window, I saw her, Lisa, my daughter-in-law. Her coat was too new, her posture too rehearsed. She pretended to examine the pastry display, her eyes scanning the shop. I told Beatrice I'd handle it. When I approached, Lisa turned sharply, her composure cracking for a split second before the mask returned. "Martha," she said, using my first name as if we were polite acquaintances. "We've been so worried." I crossed my arms. "You found me," I said. "Now you can stop worrying." She looked around, lowering her voice. "Can we talk privately?" I gestured toward the empty booth near the window. She sat opposite me, legs crossed, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "This isn't what you think," she began. "Alex is under so much stress. He didn't mean for any of this to go so far." I let her talk, her words flowing like pre-rehearsed dialogue. She said they'd only wanted to help me, that the papers were a misunderstanding, that the article was his idea, meant to reach out. Every sentence was a careful construction of half-truths, designed to sound compassionate while shifting blame. I waited until she ran out of air, then asked, "Why the dumpster?" Her face went blank. "What?" I leaned forward. If it was all concern and misunderstanding, why did he put me in the trash? For a moment, her eyes filled with something that might have been shame or fury. It was hard to tell. "He panicked," she whispered. "You can't imagine how hard it's been for him." I almost laughed. "No," I said quietly. "I can't." When she stood to leave, she pulled an envelope from her purse and placed it on the table. "This is from Kieran," she said. "He wanted me to give it to you." I hesitated before picking it up. "He's the only one who doesn't need a messenger," I said. She nodded, avoiding my gaze, then walked out. Through the window, I watched her cross the street and disappear into a waiting car. The encounter left me trembling, not from fear, but from the realization of how predictable their tactics were. When emotional blackmail stops working, they send guilt wrapped in polite packaging. I'd been that packaging for years. Now I was done. Inside the envelope was a photograph of Kieran as a child, maybe 8 years old, grinning at the camera, dirt on his cheeks, my arm around his shoulders. Tucked behind it was a note in his handwriting. I remember. I always remembered. I pressed the paper to my chest, a slow warmth spreading through the ache. That single sentence undid every attempt his parents had made to erase me. It reminded me that legacy isn't measured by inheritance or reputation. It's measured by what of your kindness survives in another person. That night, Dara came by with updates. "The charges are moving forward," she said. "Financial fraud, elder coercion, falsification of documents. They'll want your testimony." I agreed, my voice steady. I wasn't afraid of the courtroom or the questions. I was afraid only of being talked over again. "Make sure they let me finish my sentences," I told her. She smiled. "I will." 2 weeks later, the trial date was set. Local news picked up the story again, this time framed differently. Son accused of exploiting missing mother. The narrative was shifting, truth finding its way through the noise. On the morning of the hearing, I wore the patched wool coat from the thrift store and walked to the courthouse with Dara beside me. Cameras flashed when we arrived. I didn't flinch. Inside, Alex sat at the defendant's table, polished as ever, his face arranged into remorse. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw it, the flicker of disbelief that I was still standing. He had thought the shove would finish me. It hadn't. It had only begun the long climb back. When I took the stand, my voice didn't shake. I described everything in sequence: the visit to the storage lot, the forged documents, the dumpster, the silence afterward. The courtroom was quiet except for the scratching of pens. I looked at him only once when I said, "You told me to stay with garbage, and I did, until I realized garbage can still be reclaimed." His face tightened. The lawyer tried to interrupt, but the judge gestured for me to continue. So I did. Every word deliberate, measured, clear. By the end of that day, I felt something close to peace. Justice would take time, but it was already happening in smaller ways. In the posture of my shoulders, in the way Dara squeezed my hand as we left the courthouse, in the quiet nod Arthur gave me when I told him it was over for now. I returned to the bakery the next morning, flouring my hands, pressing the dough as the ovens warmed. Outside, the newspaper lay on the doorstep again, this time with a different headline: Mother Speaks. I didn't read the article. I didn't need to. I already knew the ending. I had survived his erasure, and in surviving, I had rewritten the story entirely. The morning the verdict came, the sky over town was the color of wet stone, neither dark nor bright, suspended in that uneasy stillness before something final happens. I woke early, not out of nerves, but out of habit. Old women rise with dawn because the body remembers what it means to prepare. I boiled water for tea, dressed carefully in the same patched wool coat I'd worn at every hearing, and pinned my late husband's small silver brooch at the collar. It had been his mother's once, shaped like a bird with open wings. I didn't wear it for luck but for witness, as if some part of the past deserved to see how this chapter ended. Outside, the street was quiet. Even the usual hum of delivery trucks was absent, as though the world itself was holding its breath with me. The courthouse felt colder than usual, the kind of institutional chill that seeps through clothing and memory alike. Dara met me at the entrance, her folders pressed tight against her chest, her face pale but resolute. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "remember that this is your story, not theirs." I nodded, the words settling somewhere deep inside me like small stones anchoring the current. When we entered the courtroom, Alex was already seated at the defendant's table. He looked smaller than I remembered, as if the months of exposure had eroded the arrogance that once carried his frame. Yet even in that reduced state, there was a kind of defiance about him, the habitual entitlement that years of indulgence had woven into his posture. He avoided my eyes, but I could see the nervous rhythm of his jaw clenching and unclenching, a small boy's tell of guilt poorly disguised as control. The judge entered, the murmurs ceased, and the proceedings began. I barely heard the formalities. I watched instead the hands of the clerk, the way she turned each page with quiet precision, as though history itself was being unrolled one careful sheet at a time. The prosecutor spoke first, outlining the evidence: bank statements, forged signatures, the fraudulent property transfer, and the testimony of witnesses who'd seen me walking injured and alone after the incident. It all unfolded like a story, written in ink too permanent to deny. Alex's lawyer tried to counter with claims of mental instability, repeating the familiar rhetoric of filial concern, but the words sounded hollow, rehearsed, almost archaic in their tone. When he mentioned that I had wandered away from home and rejected multiple offers of help, A ripple of discomfort moved through the courtroom. The narrative that had once suffocated me was now collapsing under its own absurdity. When the judge called for a recess, I stepped outside into the hallway. The corridor smelled faintly of lemon polish and fear. I sat on a bench near the window, staring at the rain streaking down the glass. Dara joined me quietly. "He'll take the stand next," she said. "Are you ready?" I smiled faintly. "I've been ready since the dumpster," I replied. It wasn't bravado. It was truth. Something inside me had solidified that day, a core of steel beneath the bruises. No verdict could alter it. When we returned, Alex was sworn in. His voice, once smooth as oil, now wavered at the edges. He told his story with the precision of someone who'd practiced it in the mirror. How he'd found his mother confused. How she'd become aggressive. How he'd only guided her away to prevent harm. Each sentence twisted the knife of distortion just enough to sound plausible to anyone who didn't know the texture of his lies. But I could see the unraveling in his eyes, the slight panic whenever the prosecutor asked for specifics. Times, dates, witnesses. He couldn't remember the details of his own inventions. When they played the surveillance footage from the storage facility, the grainy image of him leading me behind the building, the brief, unmistakable movement of his arm, my body stumbling backward. There was an audible intake of breath across the courtroom. He looked down, face blank, hands folded tightly, as though pressing against the evidence might make it vanish. Then came my turn. The judge asked if I wished to make a statement before the verdict. I stood, my knees trembling only slightly, and walked to the center of the room. The silence was absolute. "I was born before most of you were," I began. "I've lived through wars, recessions, and a lifetime of men who believed silence was the same as peace. It's not. Silence is a slow kind of death, and I've died that way more than once." My voice steadied as I went on. "When my son threw me into that dumpster, he didn't just discard a person. He discarded history. He thought he was throwing away something weak, something finished. But the thing about what people throw away is that it keeps existing. It keeps breathing. It crawls out when no one's looking." I could feel every gaze fixed on me. The jurors, the lawyers, even the bailiff, frozen mid-breath. "He told me to stay with garbage," I continued. And I did, for a while. I stayed there long enough to see what gets buried when people stop looking. I found pieces of myself there, bits of strength I'd forgotten, courage I didn't know was still alive. So when you decide his fate today, remember this. The act of survival is its own kind of testimony. I'm not asking for revenge. I'm asking for acknowledgement. Because once the world sees what's been done in the darkness loses its power. When I sat down, Dara reached for my hand, her eyes glistening. The judge called for quiet, though no one had moved. Then the jury was dismissed to deliberate. Time became elastic, minutes stretching into hours, or maybe it was only 1 hour that felt like a lifetime. I spent it watching the rain outside the tall windows, the drops tracing lines like the veins on my hands. It occurred to me that I was older than anyone else in that building, older than the courthouse itself, and that my endurance was its own quiet verdict. When the jury returned, the foreman stood, holding a folded slip of paper. His voice was calm, almost ceremonial. "We find the defendant guilty on all charges." There was a collective exhale, the sound of a truth finally landing. Alex's head dropped, the arrogance dissolving into a kind of dazed vacancy. For a fleeting moment, I saw not the manipulator, not the thief, but the frightened child who used to hide behind me during thunderstorms. The image hurt, but it didn't weaken me. Compassion without delusion is the final stage of liberation. The judge's gavel fell, sharp and clean. Sentencing would come later, but I already knew the outcome didn't matter. What mattered was the inversion of the story. The one who had been thrown away was standing, and the one who had done the throwing was being taken out. Ironically, to the same alley behind the courthouse where the police van waited. As I stepped outside into the gray afternoon, I saw the officers leading him away, his hands cuffed, his suit damp with rain. The smell of wet concrete filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of exhaust. For a moment, the scene mirrored itself with cruel symmetry. Him being placed into a confined metal space, me standing free in the open air. He turned slightly, his eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second. There was no recognition in them, only disbelief that I had made it this far. I didn't flinch. I just nodded once, a gesture not of forgiveness but of finality. Dara stood beside me, silent. Then she said softly, "It's over." I shook my head. "No," I said. "It's corrected." We walked down the courthouse steps together, the sound of the rain muffled against our coats. Reporters called my name, cameras flashed, but their noise felt distant, irrelevant. I had spent years being unseen. I didn't need their visibility now. I needed quiet, and I had earned it. Later that evening, I went back to the bakery. It was closed, the windows fogged from the day's heat, but Beatrice had left the back door unlocked for me. Inside, the smell of bread lingered, warm, comforting, real. I lit a single candle on the counter and sat down. The day's weight began to settle in my bones, but it was not exhaustion. It was release. I thought of my husband, of the years I had spent making other people's comfort my measure of worth. I thought of Kieran, somewhere out there reading headlines he never asked for, maybe finally understanding the difference between truth and inheritance. I whispered a small prayer, not for Alex, not even for justice, but for endurance, that stubborn flame that had refused to die even when buried under garbage. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, low and steady. I stood, blew out the candle, and looked at my reflection in the darkened window. The woman staring back was lined and tired. Yes, but her eyes were steady. There was no tremor left in her hands, no apology in her posture. She had walked through the worst kind of betrayal and emerged not pure, not whole, but real. And that, I thought, was enough. When I finally stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The street was empty except for the shimmering puddles reflecting the courthouse lights far down the road. I walked home slowly, breathing in the scent of wet earth, every step a quiet declaration. I have survived. I have spoken. And the story, once buried, now belongs entirely to me. The weeks after the verdict passed in a kind of soft blur, the way light diffuses through a curtain when the sun is strong, but you no longer need to squint against it. For the first time in years, my days were mine, unclaimed, unmeasured, quiet. I no longer woke with dread clawing at my chest. I woke to the gentle creak of the floorboards and the sound of sparrows nesting near my window. The bakery opened at 6, and though Beatrice told me I could take time off, I kept coming. Work had become less about survival and more about rhythm, a way to remind my hands that they were still good for creation, not just defense. There was peace in kneading dough, in shaping something pliable into form, in watching it rise from nothing but water, flour, and will. That was how I felt too, risen, though scarred. Proof that even what has been crushed can rise again if given warmth. People in town stopped whispering. The article that once called me missing was replaced by one that called me brave. I didn't much care for either. I wasn't brave. I was simply unwilling to remain invisible. The newspaper wrote about the trial, about elder abuse and moral accountability, and strangers began sending letters to the bakery, some from nearby towns, others from places I'd never been. Women mostly. They told their own stories, some whispered, some furious, all laced with the same ache. One wrote, "He said no one would believe me either, but you've reminded me they might." Another, "I've been quiet for 40 years. You've made me think it isn't too late." I read each letter slowly, sometimes more than once, sometimes with tears staining the ink. I didn't answer them. I didn't know how to respond to women who saw salvation in my pain. But I kept them all in a wooden box beside my bed, each envelope a small chorus reminding me that survival multiplies when spoken aloud. Dara visited less frequently once the paperwork was done, though we still shared tea every few Sundays. She told me she was leaving for another city to help start a program for elderly financial victims. "You inspired this," she said. I laughed softly and told her that I had merely tripped into history and gotten loud about it. But I understood what she meant. One life's correction can ripple outward, like a single stone dropped into still water. When she left that afternoon, she hugged me tightly, her usual composure breaking for a heartbeat. "You were my first case where the ending felt like justice," she whispered. I told her there is no such thing as justice, only balance returned. We both smiled because we knew how fragile that balance can be. Arthur still came by the bakery on Thursdays. He never mentioned Alex, though I knew he'd read the papers. We talked instead about ordinary things: birds returning, the stubborn tulips I had planted in small pots by my window, the way silence changes its color when it's no longer laced with fear. One afternoon, he brought me a new sketch. A woman standing near an open gate, her face turned toward something we couldn't see. "You," he said simply. "Leaving." I stared at it for a long while before I spoke. "Leaving what?" He shrugged. "The part of the story that hurt too much to carry." I framed that sketch above my bed. It reminded me not of departure, but of permission. As for Alex, I learned through Dara that he had been sentenced to 2 years in prison, with restitution and community service. I felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only distance, as if that chapter belonged to another lifetime's mythology. Occasionally, I wondered what he thought of me now, whether he still convinced himself of his innocence, or whether some fragment of truth had begun to seep in. But I didn't linger on it. The tether between us had finally dissolved. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't a door you walk through. It's a horizon you stop chasing. I didn't need him absolved to feel free. I only needed the silence between us to be clean. One morning, I did something that felt ceremonial, though I hadn't planned it that way. I walked to the storage lot where everything began. It had changed little. The same rusted gate, the same gravel path, the same metal containers baking under the sun. I found the dumpster, the one they had emptied and repainted months ago, bright green now instead of brown. I stood before it for a long time, not crying, not speaking, just breathing. The wind carried the faint smell of oil and dust. I reached out and touched the metal, cool under my fingers, and whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't gratitude for the pain, but for what had come after, the strength, the clarity, the reclamation. That dumpster had been the lowest point of my existence, and the exact place where I stopped being someone's property. When I turned to leave, I noticed a stray cat watching me from under a car, its eyes alert, distrustful, yet alive. "You and me both," I said to it softly, and it blinked as if in understanding, before vanishing into the weeds. Back home, I opened Kieran's second letter. It had arrived a few days earlier, forwarded from Dara's office. In it, he wrote, "Dad won't talk about what happened. I don't know how to feel, but I want to see you. I remember how you used to make me promise to look people in the eye when I told the truth. I think I'm ready." I read it 3 times before I smiled. Maybe we would meet, maybe not. Either way, a bridge had been rebuilt across the silence. The next morning, I wrote him back. "Come if you want to see what surviving looks like. It isn't pretty, but it's whole." I mailed it without fear of what might follow. Love, once reclaimed, no longer frightens you. As spring deepened, the tulips bloomed on my windowsill. Their colors were uneven, some petals half open, others stubbornly closed, but they were mine. I sat by the window most evenings, tea in hand, watching the sun melt over the rooftops. Life had become beautifully small, measured in the hiss of the kettle, the smell of baking bread, the quiet joy of doing nothing without guilt. Sometimes, young women passing by the shop would smile at me as if they knew, and perhaps they did. Pain leaves a kind of light behind it, visible only to those who've carried their own. I no longer dream of the dumpster. When I do dream, it's of walking along a road lined with trees, the sound of gravel underfoot steady and certain. Somewhere ahead, I hear laughter, not cruel, not mocking, but light, like the first sound a child makes before language. I always wake before I reach it, and that's fine. Some destinations are meant to remain ahead, pulling us gently forward. Now, each night before I sleep, I write a single line in my notebook. Some nights it's a memory, other nights just a thought, but always something true. Last night I wrote, "They called me garbage. I became soil instead." Because soil, unlike trash, holds the promise of new things. And that is what I want every woman like me to know, that nothing and no one has the right to define your worth by what they discard. We can be buried, broken, silenced, but we can also root, breathe, and rise again. So if you find this story someday, if you are sitting alone and wondering whether it's too late to climb out of whatever darkness has claimed you, let me tell you gently, it isn't. The lid may close, the laughter may echo, the world may forget your name for a while, but you are still breathing beneath it all. And when you push that lid open, when the light hits your face, you'll realize the miracle isn't that you survived. It's that you're still capable of growing toward the sun.